Morning. So this is the first of 4 recordings that focuses on sampling. So this first one is just to give you an overview. Then you will need to go and listen to the recording that is on quantitative sampling, particularly if you're using a quantitative method, or qualitative sampling if you're planning to use a qualitative method. I've also put together one recording which just actually is to help you think about making the decisions when you come to design the sampling strategy in your dissertation. So that's probably one to watch a little bit later on. So first of all, perhaps if I just explain why we need to sample. So a sample is a selection of people from the population that we're interested in studying. And we use samples because we can't actually reach out to everybody who we could possibly talk to because we just don't have time. So I've got an example here. So you want to understand the factors that influence customer retention in the fitness industry. So, for example, people who are gym members quite often leave after a period of time, often quite quickly, and they often don't maintain their use of the gyms. So it's an area where we have quite a lot of loss of customers and quite a high turnover. So let's think who we might want to talk to or get information from. So we've got our gym customers. And then where? Well, okay, so, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about just Dorset? Are we talking about the United Kingdom? Or are we talking about the world? And, you can sort of see that actually, of course, there are gym customers all over the world. So potentially, the people who you might want to talk to are, many millions. And you need to make some decisions about who it is exactly that you want to talk to and who is going to be in that sample, because you're not going to be able to obviously talk to everybody. So if we just introduce some other concepts now. So these are some key definitions. So a population is the total category of subjects. So if we were talking about the population of gym customers, that could be anyone who uses a gym anywhere in the world. So you've got a very big population. It's a very big population, even if we were just looking at people in the UK. And that is our population. And then sampling, as I said, is this idea of obtaining a sample, a smaller group of that population, and arguing that its characteristics, are the same or very close to those of the population as a whole. Now, one of the things we often use here is what's called a sampling frame. Now, a sampling frame is a complete list of all the cases in the population from which your sample will be drawn. So, I don't think we have a sampling frame for people who are gym customers, but if we did have one, it would be a complete list of all the people who use a gym in the UK. So that's a lot of people, and also, I don't think such a list exists. So you can see the problem in red there, which is that basically we often don't have these sampling frames for, particularly in event management, tourism, hospitality, sports contexts. They often just don't exist. What we might have related to the example I've been using on gym customers is if we're actually doing our research in conjunction with a particular gym, they might have the list of all the people who are members or users of that gym. So if you were working for David Lloyd, they will have, a list of their members, certainly. And they might have a list of their members, not just for their particular gym, but possibly for the national organisation. So if you were working with them and doing some research, they may be able to provide that as a sampling frame. But what you have to understand then is that is a sampling frame of David Lloyd customers. It is not a sampling frame of all gym customers in the UK, because David Lloyd is relatively high cost gym compared to many others which are much cheaper and much more basic. So they will have a different customer base. So it's not going to be representative of gym members as a whole population in the UK, but it might give you a sampling frame which would be for David Lloyd customers. I hope that makes sense. So key questions are, how do we make it representative of the population? And I've just sort of said there, you have to be quite cautious with whatever sampling frame you have, that it is representative of that sampling frame, but not necessarily of other other groups who might fall out of that. And you get problems of bias. So for instance, if you did research with David Lloyd customers, then that would be quite specific to a relatively high social economic group who can afford David Lloyd membership. It wouldn't be representative of lower income groups, for example. So we need to be careful if we want to make generalisations. If we're not too worried about making generalisations, that's okay. If we just want to do something that's specific on David Lloyd gyms, that's fine. Then you need to think about things like how large does it need to be. Now, one of there's all sorts of issues here. Now, we need to as well, and I've got a separate section that looks at qualitative research and qualitative sampling, because qualitative samples don't need to be large. They are not representative and they don't set out to be representative. And so there's a completely different thought pattern there. But for quantitative studies, they do tend to be quite large. So we're talking hundreds, say, in a questionnaire survey. And, a lot depends on whether you have got, you want it to be representative, whether you have a sampling frame, and then you can actually do some mathematical calculations to work out your sampling size if you have a sampling frame. But mostly in the areas you're studying, you won't have a sampling frame, and therefore you'll be using what's known as convenience sampling or possibly quota sampling. And in these cases, you have to make decisions about the sample size. Now, the best way to do that is often based on your data analysis considerations. Larger tends to be better, but there comes a point where having so many, it becomes pointless. And generally, samples of around about 350 people become irrelevant. But samples of 100 are quite small and often means you can't do the data analysis you need to do. So look at it that way. The other way to look at your sample size is that you can maybe you've got a time frame in which you can collect data. You collect data for that time frame and you have what you have, and then you discuss the limitations of that sample size. So if we're looking at quantitative studies, a key concept is random selection. So the idea in quantitative studies is that everybody in that target population should have an equal chance of selection. So you shouldn't be biasing it to friendly people who pass you on the street, who look like they'll complete a questionnaire. Everybody should have a chance who fits that target population to take part. And this is where we ideally have a sampling frame. But the problem is we don't always have that. So obtaining a representative sample, there's different things here. So probability sampling, this is where we have a truly random sample, and we can use this in quantitative research if we have a sampling frame. Bear in mind, most of you won't have a sampling frame. Therefore, you're likely to be using non-probability sampling. Now, if that's done carefully, it can be representative, or it can be fairly representative. So I will talk to you a bit more about that in the quantitative sampling recording. In qualitative research, again, we use non-probability sampling, and we're not actually trying to make it representative here. So we don't need to worry about that. So there's different strategies depending on whether you are doing quantitative research and you have a sampling frame, or quantitative research and you don't have a sampling frame. And qualitative research where actually we don't need to worry about it being representative. We do need to worry about selecting people carefully though. So just to give you an example of the sort of, to give you a really good, straightforward example of something that wouldn't be representative in a quantitative study. So you want to know about participant satisfaction at an event, and you sample the first 100 people to complain. Now, I posed the questionnaire, what is wrong with this sample? Now, I think it's pretty obvious. The first 100 people to complain are going to be biased. They're going to have negative views because they've already stepped up to make a point. So clearly that would not be representative. So, for example, if you were running a visitor attraction and you have a box where people put comments in, which is one way that people collect feedback, it's usually not very representative because quite often people take the time to make comments when they're fed up with something. So often they're not satisfied. So you often get negative feedback through mechanisms like that. It can nevertheless be useful for an organisation in terms of their improvement, but they don't give a representative view of what people feel about that attraction. So some of the sampling frame issues, sorry, I've said this for leisure and events, and that's my fault, I didn't amend that slide, but this actually applies for tourism, leisure, events and sport. We're all sort of have similar kinds of problems. So we want to try to identify who is in this big group of our population and is there a sampling frame. And I've posed some questions there. Is there a sampling frame for people who go to the beach, people who drink beer, people who go to nightclubs? And the answer is unfortunately not, because we've no idea who goes to the beach, completely open access space. Well, particularly in the UK, not necessarily in some places, but it's usually open access space. People who drink beer, we don't know. You might be able to find membership of some real ale societies, but apart from that, we don't have a sampling frame for people who drink beer. And neither do we know who goes to nightclubs. Lots of different people. So ways you might be able to compile a sampling frame, you might have a list of all people who've attended an event or bought tickets for an event, and that might give you a sampling frame. You might be able to compile a list of all the sport marketing companies in the UK. Maybe there's a database of an industry database you can use. So sometimes you can create a list and therefore create a sampling frame, but often we can't. So there's all sorts of challenges here. So a lot of time in the areas you'll study, you're going to be looking at non-probability sampling approaches, and they won't strictly be representative. So more on that in the slides on quantitative research and also the one on qualitative sampling. So one of the things that you need to do now is go and have a look at the other 3 recordings, one on quantitative sampling, one on qualitative sampling, and lastly have a look at the decision-making process when you're doing a dissertation.